1200 AD, and carbonized remains in good archaeological context. So we definitely know that crops spread. And there's an interesting exchange over just the last 2 weeks. 2 articles came out, one saying that the gourd genetics, so documenting all the genetics of the gourd varieties all over the world, say that it probably came from Asia, came across with the first peoples that crossed over into North America across the Bering Straits, maybe 12 to 15, 16,000 years ago, brought with them dogs probably too, and spread it throughout the Americas and then later to Polynesia. Another article says that it has genetic ties to Africa and not Polynesia, and it must have come from Africa. But what makes this exciting is all this new work and all this new energy being put with using essentially new techniques to document the movement of important crops throughout the world. This is also combined with linguistic studies, and so you can kind of see here, even, no, I'm not a linguist, and probably you aren't either, but you can see the similarities in the names, and so the name probably traveled with the plant, that means people. So, Thor Heyerdahl. Most biographers are somewhat biased, and a lot of the biographers were his friends, and so it's kind of hard to sort of sort through the different to sort of get the real Thor Heyerdahl from a lot of these writings. But all of them highlight him as a maverick and an outsider. Many biographies simply reproduce his text that he wrote himself from his many publications without serious critique. And his own books are very autobiographical in structure and argument, strategically promoting himself for funding and his lifelong goal to convince the scholarly community that he was right. He was born in 1914 in Norway. His father was a master brewer, comes from a modest family. He had little or no money when he started the Tiki expedition and survived with a small family doing dock work, various places in Canada and the United States. It's a sharp contrast to most of the explorers of the day that came from very wealthy families, were well placed politically and socially. He studied zoology and geography for a few years, but never graduated with a degree from the University of Oslo, and spent considerable time in a private library in Norway with the world's best collection of books and articles on Oceania. And this is where he began to get his ideas and spark his interests in experimental archaeology, travel, and explaining unity of culture. On a small expedition sponsored by 2 of his professors, he traveled to Fatahiva Island in the Marquesas in 1936 with his young wife. They sort of went native for a few years, took lots of pictures, wrote a lot, and visited a lot of archaeological sites on the island and nearby islands, beginning to form his ideas, and he had a strong appreciation for Polynesians, their lifeways, incredible knowledge of the land and sea. During World War II, he served in the Norwegian Armed Forces briefly in Finland when Norway was occupied by the Germans. After the war, he was rejected by academia in New York City when trying to get his first book published. And this is when he was developing his ideas about the context of Polynesia and South America. And it really hurt him because he wanted to have this book out in the English-speaking world. Most of the major figures that he visited, trying to convince them to publish it, dismissed him and his ideas. This was a turning point in his life and philosophy of life. He considered himself a maverick outsider to the scholarly world from then on. Thor Heyerdahl's theory, he's written books about this, but I'll try to summarize it very, very briefly. So the key elements are there was a race of white gods that migrate from the Middle East to the Americas, skipping Africa. They build monumental works and create civilizations in the Andes and civilize the dark-skinned indigenous peoples. After some time, a great battle occurred in Lake Titicaca, Highland Bolivia today, and a small fair-skinned group escapes the Americas under the leadership of the bearded white leader, sun god, Wiracocha, or Kon-Tiki, using rafts and sailing west with the prevailing winds and the currents to Polynesia, spreading civilization there around AD 500. And this contradicted all views of most archaeologists that Polynesia was settled from Southeast Asia across Melanesia. This is the site of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, and according to the Andean myths that he's drawing upon very selectively, they explain the stone monuments here is Viracocha got mad at the local people and turned them into stone. And that's why we have this archaeological site. An early depiction of Viracocha, who was actually the creator god for Andean peoples, and probably the myths were meant to tell you about proper life and behavior and a little bit less about literal history that Thor Heyerdahl used it for. We know quite a bit about boats from the historical record, lots of eyewitness accounts, but little direct archaeological evidence in anywhere in the world. Australia was colonized by 40,000 years ago, so we know they had to have gotten there by some kind of sea craft. Early peopling of the Americas, even though they crossed the Bering Straits, had to cross large wetlands, lakes, go along coasts, cross rivers, and so we assume that they had boats very, very early in the Americas. But boats are not very well preserved. Types of boats documented for the Pacific coast under discussion here: dugout canoes, rafts, skin boats like kayaks and whaleboats, also reed boats, and the sewn plank boat, which we'll talk about in more detail later. Balsa wood is a very lightweight wood that many of you are familiar with if you built models in the 1950s and 60s. And it's very workable wood and also incredibly buoyant and excellent for rafts, and was used by pre-Columbian peoples, we think very early, but we only have the historical data, eyewitness accounts. So one of our best accounts is from Bartolome Ruiz, who was kind of scouting ahead on the second expedition of Pizarro before he encountered the Inca Empire. And they were off the coast. They intercepted a large ocean-going raft out of sight of the land, big sails carrying tons of produce, 20 crew members on board. And the Spanish were so happy to find this because it had lots of gold and some silver on it. That was the first that they'd encountered south of Mexico. And they threw most of the people overboard, drowned them, took 3 of them as hostages. I think they let a couple loose on shore, took them back to Mexico, learned how to use them as translators, and probably one of the reasons why Pizarro had such success of conquering the Inca Empire with 160 conquistadors was because they had control of the language. And these sailors were using Quechua probably as a lingua franca, and they were heading north. We don't know exactly where, but it could be Central America, it could be the west coast of Mexico. We have other accounts, especially a 1748 account by 2 Spanish naval officers. So the people that are going to be seeing these boats out on the ocean are going to be sailors. They know a lot about boats. So they pick up very quickly observations about what they like about these boats, what they think is great about them. And so they talk about especially the large, incredibly large cloth sails, probably made of cotton in most cases, large cargo capacity, unsinkable, and the maneuverability of these large flat rafts. A lot of the Spanish and other Europeans didn't have any clue as to how you would actually navigate something like this. There was one account of one showing up 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador near the Galapagos Islands. And so from a lot of these descriptions, we can tell something about the details that could actually maybe be put into reconstructing these. And that's exactly what Thor Heyerdahl did. He went through these accounts very carefully and developed sort of his best guess at how these things work. Note on this one, it's got actually a garden in the back there, a little kitchen garden. They're growing plants there on this boat. We also know they probably carried live animals in some cases, like llamas for meat. There have been many studies, some of this done by Heyerdahl and others later, especially the study by Duan and Hostler on the engineering of these boats based on the eyewitness accounts and the simple drawings the Spanish gave us. And the key thing here to steer these is you need these center boards. And we know they had multiple center boards that could be pulled up and down as needed to keep the thing, give it some drag in the back to keep it going in the direction that you want. And then a very flexible sail that you can kind of tip in various directions by a long cord to kind of steer the thing. And then in the back, a long steering oar or rudder that was used to stabilize and also steer. Most boats along the Pacific coast, especially the Andean region, are reed boats. And these are modern ones used by local fishermen. They're kind of like little surfboards, unsinkable. They go out, usually one person on a boat, working in pairs, set nets, maybe traps on the bottom of the ocean, and bring them in and sell them to the major cities in Peru. And we have archaeological depictions of these, although very schematic. It's obviously a typical reed boat. There's a two-person one, maybe a larger one over on the right from museum collections. But they don't show sails. And it'd be almost impossible to depict a detailed sail in a pottery vessel such as this. So maybe those kinds of things were stripped off. Also some of the steering devices. This is some from our own collection, and I love this one on the left. It's a very simple boat, stylized. It's got a guy there maybe with his shirt off, a little pouch around, maybe with his fishing gear, with a kayak-like paddle in the front. And then on the right, we see a raft, one of the Moche deities, with 4 people kind of swimming in the water, kind of guiding it with all kinds of sea animals there, some real, some not. And there are all kinds of experiments have been done. One that I really like is my student Alexi Branich, back in 2002, decided, everybody had speculated that Tiwanaku peoples had moved rocks some 20 to 40 to maybe 60 kilometers across Lake Titicaca. And some of these weighed 100 tons. So he did an experiment over about a year and a half. They built the largest boat that ever been built in Lake Titicaca, probably since prehistory, and they actually moved that 10-ton stone you can see there over on the left onto the boat and very easily navigated it with a sail in just a 2-day trip to the other end of the lake. This is it in sail. They didn't even need to use the full sail. The small sail actually worked perfectly. Now, just very quickly, I'd like to say the other side of this is the Polynesian connection. And we know quite a bit about Polynesian navigation from scholars like Ward Goodenough and Bill Davenport, who are professors and curators here of Oceania at the Penn Museum. And they wrote about navigation skills. Bill was actually a sailor himself and had his own sailing vessel that he used every weekend. They knew knowledge of the stars for navigation. They knew the rise and set of certain stars, could tell them directions, seasons. They read waves and clouds to indicate where islands were and weren't, even if they're out of view. Study bird presence and their behavior, study currents, and it had these elegant, elegant boats. They're much more maneuverable probably than the Peruvian boats, and had these very simple maps where they could record the knowledge on these portable devices and take them with them on these long journeys. It'd be interesting to sort of compare point by point the Polynesian and the South American raft traditions. I won't do that here, but kind of in my sense of the readings that you know, the Polynesians could go much faster and much more efficiently in their boats. They're very streamlined. We know they had incredible skills at finding tiny, tiny islands, little specks out in the Pacific Ocean. The South American boats, though, were larger, could carry more cargo, and were pretty much unsinkable. So let's move to the Kon-Tiki expedition. So Thor Heyerdahl finally got a little bit of funding. Most of it was from taking out big loans from his friends. He had no money of his own at that time. And he also got some help, equipment especially, from the U.S. Army, who essentially opened up one of their supply depots in Peru and gave him all kinds of survival gear, equipment, radio, and things like this that were key to the success of the expedition. They went up to Guayaquil, Ecuador, and went into the forests there, the intact tropical forests, cut down their main logs. There were 9 balsa trunks that they cut down, then shipped as a group down to Callao, Peru, the port of Lima.